Hello and welcome to Theology Unleashed. I'm Arjuna and this is the channel where Eastern theology meets Western skepticism. I'm very excited about today's discussion. I've got two special guests, Akhandadhi Das and Michael Egnor. Both of them have spent quite a bit of time thinking about the metaphysics of their respective faith traditions and how they map onto modern science. So we'll start with a brief introduction by each of our guests. So Michael Egnor, could you please start?
Sure. Thank you, Arjuna, and Akhandadhi. It's a privilege and a pleasure to meet you, and thank you for this talk. I was raised in a kind of a vaguely Protestant atmosphere in upstate New York, and attended church occasionally with my mother. Wasn't baptized as a child, and I found religion strange but appealing in a sense that I really felt that there were profoundly important things about our existence and about the universe, and religion at least tried to answer some of those things. But I was also fascinated by science. I was a real science geek as a kid. I spent much of my adult life as being irreligious, and I might even at times have identified as an atheist because I felt that the doctrinal aspects of religion didn't make a lot of sense, and I kind of felt as though if I were to attend church as an adult and get serious about religion, I'd kind of have to leave my brain at the door. That the real truth was to be found in science. But I still had this haunting feeling. It was kind of a creepy feeling that I would get every once in a while. I'd think that I found myself in this life, and I didn't know where I came from, and I didn't know whether I was going anywhere or why I was here. I think a lot of people have those feelings, and but I didn't pursue it too strongly. My youngest son was born in 2000, and when he was a very small baby, he wasn't really paying attention to us. He wouldn't look at us, he wouldn't smile, and we were very concerned that he had autism. And I was pretty terrified of this. I always thought that autism was one of the most frightening disorders. So one night, I'm a physician. I'm a neurosurgeon, and I was seeing a patient in consultation at a Catholic hospital, and I was going through a lot of emotional distress because of this. And I went to the chapel in the hospital, and I prayed to God. I said, God, I don't know if you exist, but if you do exist, I beg of you to please not let my baby be autistic. That I can't deal with it. I can't have a child that I love who doesn't know me. And I heard a voice, and I've never heard a voice before or since, but it was very real, and it wasn't my voice. And the voice said, "But that's what you're doing to me." And I replied that, okay, I won't do it to you anymore. I won't be autistic to you. Just don't please let my son be autistic to me. And within a few days, my son was smiling and was normal. He totally recovered. He's not autistic at all. In fact, I'm going to his graduation next week from college. So I started going to churches, and I fell in love with the Catholic Church, and I got baptized, and I have loved the Lord and pursued understanding and knowing Him. And I've had several experiences in my life, one of which, besides this with my son, was clearly supernatural. There's no doubt about it. I've become very interested in a number of topics, particularly in the relationship between science and religion, because I really believe that religious perspectives offer profound insight into scientific reality. And I think that materialism is a terrible form of ignorance, and I think science has been crippled by its reliance on physicalism and materialism. I don't know much about Hinduism. What I do know about Hinduism, I have great respect for. I think it's a very profound way of looking at God and at humanity and at science. So I'm fascinated to hear more about it.
Cool. Thank you for sharing that, Michael. Akhandadhi, could you please give us a brief introduction? And thank you for coming on.
Well, thank you, Arjun, and thank you, Michael. I've certainly seen some of your videos online, and very fascinated by some of the approaches, which I see there's going to be quite a bit of overlap. And in fact, there's overlap in our backgrounds. I was brought up in I think you could say, quite a seriously Protestant background in Belfast, and attended church, Bible class, youth clubs, all our whole existence was centered around the church. And I think that laid down my spirituality from an early age. But we were also a scientific family. My mother taught physics and chemistry. So I had a balanced view, and always felt that there cannot be a real dichotomy between understanding the nature of this world and understanding the nature of the spirit and God, and that these things must really tie together. So I was a teenager when the Troubles erupted in Northern Ireland, the trouble between the Protestant and Catholic communities, and attending school right in the centre of Belfast, where we'd hear bombs go off during the day, and sometimes the teacher would even send us to go and check out what building had been damaged. So that also gave me a little perspective that how are we doing religion in the name of God? Have we actually got a good enough understanding that if we're willing to have this sort of strife and disparity between religions, it just didn't seem right. And I think during my teenage years, I certainly became influenced by various scientific views. I don't think I ever bought them, but I certainly used them in arguments to challenge the existence of God or existence of faith. But I don't think it ever really left me the idea that there is something more and we just need to push harder to try and uncover it. So I did start reading into Indian philosophy, and particularly attracted by ideas of reincarnation, karma, and all the usual ones. And of course, the tendency is when people come upon Indian philosophy, they often get the understanding either superficially that there are many gods, or if they delve a little bit deeper, they hear a philosophical view that says, well, ultimately there's a sort of oneness of all existence, and that oneness is God. And I think I entertained that as part of my journey. But actually, it's not the full picture. And it's not even, I would say, the complete or best understanding of the Vedanta teaching. So I wanted to go beyond Advaita. And then I discovered that actually there was aspects of Vedanta philosophy not so well known in the Western kind of theological circles, which understood God as the supreme personality, but at the same time, the source of all existence. And in fact, that becomes the sort of definition that Vedanta uses. That from which everything else comes, that is God. But at the same time, God is not just the totality of it. He is the personality that is at the core of all of this, from which everything else comes, including ourselves as individual beings, so that we can have a relationship which is ultimate, the source of love. And anything we're doing in this world really is a sort of mimicking of trying to find that sort of perfect relationship of love that we could have with the Supreme Personality. We try to find it with ourselves almost as the recipient of the love and attention and service from other beings. And hence there's all sorts of problems. So I was at university studying architecture, and I enjoyed it, really liked it, but still feeling that I was missing out on what was probably something more dear to me, and that was spiritual searching and really delving into philosophy and the religious path that I wanted to take. And at one point, after 2 years at university, have we lost Michael? Or is it? Oh, sorry, we lost you for a second, Michael. But at university, just after 2 years, I got what I think in many traditions would be called a calling. It just felt like someone was saying inside, well, you know what you really want to do, you know what your priority is, time to go and do it. And at that time, because I'd been reading the books of A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami, particularly Bhagavad Gita, Isopanishad, and Bhagavatam, particular texts that he had. And I was so impressed with his presentation of Vedanta philosophy in a personalist way that I decided time to skip university, and I headed off and joined the ashram. And that was nearly 50 years ago. And since then, I've been kind of delving deeper and deeper into the philosophy, and it's a practical and experiential philosophy, in that it's not just knowledge, but it's combined with practices which are meditative, in that they open up one and help one's mind become clear for meditating and praying and feeling closer to God. But at the same time, it's all within a particular system called bhakti, which means devotion, which ultimately is orientating our very self in a devotional relationship with God. And the idea is that by doing this, one falls in love with God as the process. And I'm not saying I'm a good lover of God, but certainly I have become more and more attached and attracted to my relationship with God over the years, and I felt the personal benefit, kindness, inspiration, and something for which I'm very grateful for in all these years. But and within that, I think my service has come to be presenting the Vedanta ideas in a way that shows their parallels and their way of dealing with some of the bigger issues of Western philosophy and science. And I think I found that Vedanta has helped me understand many of the scientific issues better. And I think my delving into some of the scientific matters has helped me actually recognize the rather brilliance and lovingness of God in this world. So,
thank you for sharing that. So now we can move on to the metaphysics. So we're not so much defending these views against skeptics today, rather we're just presenting what the views are so that we can each understand them. And it's an interfaith discussion too, so we can see the differences between Thomism and the Vedanta views. So Michael, would you like to start by briefly explaining your understanding of Thomism? So I guess our focus here would be the soul, the world, or matter, and God, the ontology of that.
Sure. Sure. If I could just sidetrack for just a second, because one thing that Akhandadhi said that really resonated with me is his growing appreciation of God's love from God and love of God. And I've had kind of a similar experience, and I've always found so much of the beauty in religious belief. I find in Christianity and religious belief in general is wonderful, but I couldn't over the years really conjure up a deep sense of love for God. How do you love an omnipotent, omniscient being that you can't see and controls everything? It's difficult. And I was reading the Gospel of John some years ago, and I was contemplating Jesus' pilgrimage to Jerusalem when he knew that he was going to be crucified. And I was thinking a lot about what that meant, about to as a human being to know what's going to happen to you, and that you were going to have to experience this horror. And in the Garden of Gethsemane, when the soldiers came to arrest him, I was floored by John 18:8, in which Jesus said to the soldiers, "You came for me, so let these men go." And that just totally astonished me. I think about it every day, that kind of love, that he, who I believe is God, would, in this situation of the most horrible moment of his life, when he's facing this excruciating death, his first thought was for the men who were with him, to make sure that they were safe. And that moved me deeply, and that opened my heart to the love of God. It really changed the way I look at God. So I think from the Christian perspective, one of the great beauties of Christianity is that the incarnation gives us a way to know and love God on a personal basis that's much easier for us as human beings. And in fact, Thomas Aquinas believed that when asked what was the reason for the incarnation, why did God have to become a human being to save us? Aquinas' answer surprised me at first when I first read it, but in retrospect, I think I see what he means. And he said that the incarnation and the crucifixion make it so much easier for us to love him. It's a way of loving him that's not abstract. It's loving a friend who gave his life for you. So that meant a lot to me. And so what you say about the love of God and love for God, I've been thinking a lot about myself, and we each find different ways to it, but it's a very beautiful thing when it comes. On the question of metaphysics, I became fascinated with Aristotle and with St. Thomas Aquinas, and I had always felt, I was a biochemistry major in college, and have always loved science and have thought a great deal about science. But I'd always felt that the modern scientific way of looking at things was missing something on a deep level, that it was too mechanical. That a very good example was, as a biochem major, I learned about all these beautiful biochemical processes, the Krebs cycle, all these things that go on that allow us to metabolize things and so on. And I said, all that is beautiful, except that no one explains who's guiding all of this. That is, we're talking about these incredibly delicate processes that are going on constantly and go on a level that is frankly beautiful. But there's no reference to where does the beauty come from? Where does the guide come from? It's not just soup. I mean, it's not just stuff mixed in a blender. So I really fell in love with Aristotle's view of what the natural world is. And Aristotle asked, the question is, what can we know about what really exists? And he says that for any particular object in the natural world, there are two things that you can know about it. You can know whatever is intelligible about it in terms of its shape, its color, its size, things of that sort. And you can know that it is a particular example of that thing, as opposed to another possible example of that thing. That is that if you look at a tree in your yard, you can know everything there is to know about the tree, and he called that the principle of intelligibility, or the form. And you can know that it's that tree and not an identical tree in your neighbor's yard. So that's a principle of individuation, which he called matter. And he developed an entire metaphysical perspective on this contrast between form and matter. And he explained change that way. He explained the soul that way. He explained the soul as the form of the body. And I came to see that his explanation for form and matter also was a beautiful way of understanding very important things in quantum mechanics. And Werner Heisenberg also recognized this, that collapse of the quantum waveform could be understood as the potency of matter, the potentiality is the multiple possible quantum states that a particle can have, and the form of the particle is what it becomes when you think of it with your intellect, that reduces the potency to act. So there's beautiful ways of looking at science based on the Thomistic Aristotelian way. Of course, St. Thomas was an Aristotelian. And the Thomistic view of the soul, I think, is a very powerful way of understanding the soul, and actually working on a book on that right now. So I can stop here, but I can go in more of that. I don't want to talk too much here.
Akhandadhi, do you have any responses to that, or do you want to move into Vedanta metaphysics?
Yeah, well, I'd like to pick up. I certainly want to discuss more on the Thomistic idea of the soul, but you brought up the kind of Aristotle's view, and from our kind of understanding of the kind of the sharing of ancient traditions, it does seem that there was certainly dialogue between India, the Levant, and the Greek civilizations. Mm-hmm. So it wouldn't be surprising that there are parallels in Greek thought, particularly as you expressed with Aristotle, and some of the different schools of thinking in India. Now, I've mentioned Vedanta. Vedanta is the particular set of theological kind of analysis of the nature of God and what is called Brahman, the totality of spirit, and how that relates to us as the individual souls. But there are also other kind of traditions that work together. Some academics cannot see, or rather they see them as discrete philosophical schools. But actually, when you understand what they're each alluding to, you see that they are part of a complete picture of where we are in this world. So one of the metaphysics school, that's called Sankhya. And that, for some people, that doesn't tie well with Vedanta, but for the Vaishnava Vedanta, which is the particular type of Vedanta that I'm interested in, which is the personalist belief in God, it actually ties well together, and it also ties well with the whole yoga teaching. So Sankhya philosophy is an analysis of the metaphysics of this world. And there is Vaishnava Sankhya, which then ties it back to God and sees the world as the energy emanating from God, and which can be transformed in various ways. And it talks about exactly the same points, that really we're talking about, when we look at the world, we're seeing forms that are produced from a substrate of matter. And they have these two types of things where they've got the samanya, which is the commonality. You know, the trees, there's a certain features that make them trees. But then they have the vishesha, which is the specific type of tree or specific individual tree. And everything, as you say, is coming from a state of great potential. And ultimately, choices are being made, which is honing it down to the specifics that we see in this world. So from the Vedanta point of view, everything is energy and information. And when energy and information, when information inheres on energy, it produces material forms, which are then observable to our properties, to our properties which are observable to our senses. So when we look out at the world, all we're seeing is the manifestation of a type of material energy, which Vedanta and Sankhya call Prakriti. Prakriti is the generalized energy, which can then manifest within physical properties. So that is one way of slicing up or analyzing the world. And the interesting thing is the way that Sankhya describes the particular qualities and properties that we observe ties in the observer into the system, both in perception and also in manifestation. Because you gave the example of the kind of quantum potential of kind of the wave function, and yet it collapses in a particular format. Now, John Stuart Bell was another Belfast boy. I think he was studying at the Tech Belfast next door to where my mother was teaching. So I kind of feel a connection, and I may even have maybe even some long lost relative connection as well. But anyway, John Stuart Bell's inequality theorem at least demonstrated that when quantum systems collapse, it's not because of anything that is kind of post-quantum, nothing in the electrophysical world. And therefore, many people have taken that, oh, it just must be random. But at least physicists these days are now beginning to suspect that maybe it's not actually random. Maybe there are rules, laws, effects, causality underlying the quantum state that produce the specific forms that would come out from the potential possibilities of the quantum state. And that's something that I'm sure you've talked to physicists, and I've discussed this with physicists about as well. And this then ties back with another aspect of Sankhya, which says that actually the way God is working in this world is to allow it to fulfill the desires of all the souls. And that the intentions of the souls are being gathered and then being allowed to feed in to inform the type of collapse that quantum states might have. Now, the Sankhya doesn't describe it in terms of quantum physics, but it talks about it in such a way that that seems to be a parallel that we would recognize. That would seem to be part of the root, if you like, from intentionality of within the minds of the souls being captured and facilitated in the manifestation of how things work in this world. Now, that makes sense because the Vedanta has a broader picture of the nature of what we talk about, if you mean the soul or the Atman, and the nature of consciousness. And this perhaps is one of the distinguishing features of Vedanta compared, say, with Aristotelian philosophies and even, general Abrahamic faiths, in that we do not believe that consciousness is created in this world. Rather, consciousness is as timeless and eternal as God himself. It's that as long as God has existed, he has manifested the souls and manifested the consciousness of every individual being. So that's how we understand it, not forever in the future, but forever in the future and forever in the past. And therefore, even prior to the manifestation of the universe, the consciousness of the souls exists. And their intentions can exist prior to the universe, and therefore can be used by God as, in fulfillment of those intentions, he uses that information to help manifest the world as we want to enjoy it. Because the other aspect is that Vedanta does not look at life in this material world as God's kingdom of enjoyment. Rather, it's the playpen that God puts the wayward souls who would like to try and see if they can enjoy without worrying about a service or loving relationship with God. So it's an opportunity for the souls in their eternal existence to enjoy, if you like, a break from God if they want. So somehow or other, and it seems a mad choice to have made, but it's something that we kind of think, well, if there's an original sin, it's not someone else's sin, it's my sin of turning away from the garden. And that's what brought me to the material world, not just in this lifetime, but perhaps thousands, millions, billions of lifetimes ago. Who knows the timing of that? But it just means that I've invested myself in trying to participate in the manifestation of a world where, if I want, I can live it without thinking about a relationship beyond matter, a relationship with God. I can live without that if I want. But at the same time, if I want to find that spiritual kind of refuge, and which is the true abode of consciousness, then it can also be found within this. And I think that has helped me understand the great dichotomy that exists between humans who very clearly see that this world is not created by chance and that there must be the hand of a greater intelligence behind it, and those who look at the world and say, no, don't see that at all. Can't spot that.
Just quickly, I'm hearing a little like crackling sound. Are either of you hearing that?
No.
Just really soft. Okay. I'm not sure what's causing that. So, Michael, have you got questions on that?
Sure. I think there's a profound philosophical question that arises here that is pretty well marked out in Christianity, but I don't understand it as well from the Vedanta perspective, and that is that God is the first cause or the prime mover of first cause of all that exists and the prime mover of all that changes, and that we are created by Him, and our creation is in time. It's not an eternal creation. Is the Vedantic belief that human souls are eternal as God is, and that were we created by God, or are we, in a sense, co-eternal with God?
Consciousness is co-eternal with God.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there is a distinction, and probably this is worth discussing, the nature of the soul, because we take it that when we're talking about consciousness as the source of subjective experience, free will, that's the nature of the Atma. And the Atma inhabits a material body.
Mm-hmm.
It connects with that material body through through mana, the mind. Now, mind in Sankhya is different from Western philosophy because generally there's the conflation of consciousness, mental states all together as one thing, mind. Whereas Vedanta and Sankhya and Yoga, they all clearly say, no, consciousness is its specific type of property which gives subjective experience. That has to be considered fundamental on its own. That is of the nature of Brahman, of God. Whereas the material, the body, is a manifestation of the physicality of this world in a particular structure. And connecting ourselves with the ability of the senses to gather sensory data into the brain is the mind, which basically takes that data and represents it in qualitative terms to consciousness. So that forms a kind of interface, I suppose in computing terms, between the hardware of our sensors and processing brain and the qualitative nature that we know cannot be reduced to the physics of neural activity, but it's what we experience. So that's a threefold, if you like, division of body-brain, mind, and consciousness. And the interesting thing is that Vedanta Sankhya look at the mind as that interface as a different form of manifestation of Prakriti. The Prakriti can go in these two directions. It can produce the physical objects of this world, but it can also produce the mental states. And that is why there is a connection between them. And there's therefore no interaction problem ontologically between non-physical mind and a physical brain, because they are of the same ultimate material quality, or proper material stuff, if you like. Whereas consciousness is the observer then of the format that the mind is giving us. And it's a bit like inside our computers, there's all the digital data. We don't understand, we cannot relate to that, we cannot appreciate that, but somehow or other that data is taken and cast on the screen that we have in our computer screen in front of us. And I'm able then to relate to that, under that presentation of what's going on in the computer. So similarly, we only understand what is happening in the world by what the senses receive, but we only understand what the senses and brain are processing thanks to the interface of the mind, casting it in a particular way that allows me as a conscious being to go, I see this, I feel this, I experience this.
One comment on your earlier observation that there was likely contact between the ancient Greeks and Hindu philosophers, and that certainly may account for what I think are substantial similarities between some of the ancient Greek philosophy and Hindu philosophy. In addition, of course, the contact may be because both the Greeks and the Hindus and everyone are looking at the same phenomena, and I think that this way of looking at the phenomenon is just the most accurate way, and it's been evident to multiple cultures that this does make sense. William James, psychologist in the 19th century, championed a viewpoint of the brain that I find quite fascinating. And I think is quite consistent with at least a general Christian viewpoint, and I suspect as well a Hindu viewpoint, that the mind and that the brain focuses the mind. That is, that the traditional materialist way of understanding the relationship of the mind and the brain is that either the mind doesn't exist at all and everything is just matter, which is eliminated materialism, or that the brain generates the mind. Everything in the mind is some kind of product of material processes. And what James and a number of other people have argued is that the brain does not generate the mind, the brain focuses the mind. That the mind is an entity that transcends matter and transcends the brain. And in a sense, the role of the brain in life is to allow the mind to function in a material biological world. And I think there's a tremendous amount of scientific evidence for that. Near-death experiences are perhaps the most obvious, that when one has interference with or cessation of brain function, it is a rather common experience that the mind expands enormously, that we're able to experience things on a much more profound level, which does indeed imply that the brain, I think one of the analogies people have used is that the brain is like a magnifying glass in sunlight. The mind is like the sun, and the brain allows us to focus that light on particular problems, on particular things we deal with in this material life, but that the mind isn't generated by the brain any more than the sunlight is generated by the magnifying glass. And I think it's a very nice way to look at things. The other thing that I've always found fascinating is that it is a common observation by people who meditate, that in order to broaden the mind and broaden spiritual experiences, you have to suppress the brain of sorts, or you have to suppress ordinary mental processes, which would seem to be strange. If the mind comes from the brain, why do you need to suppress thought? But certainly, Christian mystics have always found that you need to suppress your normal thoughts to open up your mind to God. What St. John of the Cross called the dark night of the soul. And which I find, I would imagine that you're familiar with his idea, that which is the idea of many mystics, is that God attempts to speak with us and even to infuse His Spirit into us, but we keep interfering. Our own thoughts, even the thoughts in which we attempt to reach God and seek God, keep getting in the way, as well intentioned as they are, and there comes a point in which God has to remove our awareness of Him for a while, which St. John of the Cross described as a dark night, as a spiritual desert. But you're actually closer to God during that time. It's just that He has to remove your presuppositions about what He is to eventually reveal what He is to you. So you have to open yourself to Him. So all of these concepts, I think, are profoundly spiritually and philosophically defensible. I think they make a lot of sense logically. And there is neuroscience to support a lot of these views. And that's one of my particular interests is understanding the mind-brain relationship by re-examining what we know about cognitive neuroscience.
Fascinating, and I'm going to also want to explore a bit on with that with you. First of all, I fully agree with your point that what each of these cultures, and I was reading some African statements which were very Vedantic on consolationism. There's all over the world, people have tuned into a similar understanding. And actually, I wonder if you'd agree that modern science seems to be heading that way very quickly through physics.
Yes.
I mean, pretty well in my discussions in the philosophy world, consciousness is out of the bag now.
Mm-hmm.
It's escaped. It's
Yes.
no longer, no one can really justify it's a neural function.
Right.
Hence, panpsychism is the big discussion, or IIT to a degree, but panpsychism is the one that's getting, and then there's the quantum ideas, Penrose and Hameroff, but really it's out of the bag. And the next one that seems to be escaping is subtle physics. What's going on at that lower level that's informing the quantum world? What's going on prior to the universe that's informing the fine-tuning of Big Bang or whatever,
Right.
There's all sorts of questions that are coming up, which, as you would say, that's looks like what Aristotle was saying. I'd say those.
Yeah.
What Vedanta is looking at. I was also fascinated by the James statement about the mind focusing, so the brain focusing the mind. I remember reading Aldous Huxley, of course, said a similar thing, and in my wayward student days, I thought that was fascinating.
Yes.
But, it was fascinating. I think I now regard it more as limiting. Mm-hmm. And as you say, the brain's got a particular function, and it's to help the mind interact and understand the world.
Right.
And this is something I'd like you to give me more on I think I heard you make a statement regarding really what the brain does is it processes our perceptive inputs, and it basically organizes our motor responses.
Mm-hmm. Yes. The Thomistic view of the soul, I think, is really corresponds very nicely to several of the most important outcomes in cognitive neuroscience research in the past century. The Thomistic view of the soul, in fact, this is actually one of the things that led me to Thomism as a metaphysical perspective. Just to backtrack for a second, when I was a medical student, I was just fascinated by the brain. I thought the brain was just the most fascinating thing on earth. So in medical school, I got a program text called Sidman, which is this big thing that that teaches you all about neuroanatomy. And so I spent countless hours just going through these pages, thinking that the more I learn about this, the more I learn about the structure of the brain, the more I would understand what it is to be human, because I really felt that the human soul, I didn't think of the soul in a religious sense, but that the human soul was to be found in the brain. That was the whole game. And as I became a neurosurgeon, I came to realize that the brain obviously has many very, very important functions, but the soul isn't there. It's an organ, just like the eye is, or the ear is, or the heart is, and it does a job. It does a really important job, but the person is not the brain, and the person is not the ear or the heart. The person is the totality, and the person has a spiritual aspect. The first thing that made me think along these lines, besides my disillusionment with the idea that, knowing the detailed anatomy of the basal ganglia was somehow going to help me understand the meaning of life, was phrenology. And I read quite a bit about phrenology. And I think that phrenologists have been, although a lot of what they said was pretty crazy, and as individuals, they were somewhat less than ethical, or at least many of them were, their idea wasn't as crazy as it first seems. In the 19th century, it became apparent that there were regions of the cerebral cortex that had specific dedicated neurological functions, the motor area, the speech area, the visual areas. And the phrenologist assumed that therefore all human activities had specific cortical regions that accounted for them. Mathematics and literature and art and ethics and all sorts of things. So everything that constituted sort of the human span of intellect, as well as perception and motor function, came from a spot on the cortex somewhere. They didn't have any means of visualizing the brain in life. They didn't have MRIs or CAT scans, and they didn't even have X-rays by and large. But they did know that the shape of the skull was roughly determined by the underlying shape of the brain. If a person has a part of their brain that is atrophied from early childhood, it's not uncommon to have a flattening of the skull in that region, because the brain and spinal fluid aren't pushing out as much. So they felt that if they could analyze the shape of the skull very carefully, they could analyze the shape of the brain, and in doing so, they could find these areas that would correspond to intellectual activities, just like Broca had found the area for speech, and various people had found the area for movement. And they turned out to be very wrong. So Broca was right, and the people who mapped the cortex for movement and for vision and so on were right. But the phrenologists were completely wrong about mapping the cortex for intellectual function. And there seemed to be a sharp dichotomy between abstract thought and concrete perceptual thought. So that my seeing of a tree in my yard, you can localize the neuronal activity that goes on when I see that tree with extreme precision. You can determine the precise neurons if you want to look closely enough. But when I think about the square root of -1, there are no localizable neurons doing that. When I think about God, there are no localizable neurons doing that. Even with the tree itself, when I think about why trees exist, if I think of deep metaphysical questions, there's no region of the brain that seems to correspond to that thought. And I wondered about this dichotomy. Why is it that some kinds of mental activities are very, very rigorously mapped to the cortex. And other kinds of mental activities have no specific location in the cortex at all. Part of my training as a neurosurgeon was to do awake craniotomies, where we had to map the cortex in order to find what exact regions of the cortex serve what functions, to remove tumors or to remove epileptic foci. And the patients had to be awake to do that. So you give them local anesthesia so they don't feel pain. The brain itself feels no pain. And I remember one time I was taking out a frontal lobe tumor in a woman, and the tumor was close to her speech area, and the tumor had infiltrated much of her left frontal lobe. But you can take out a lot of the frontal lobe without a major effect on a person. And as we were doing it, she was awake, and I was talking to her. And I thought it's so incredibly bizarre that I'm removing most of one of her frontal lobes as I'm talking to her, and she never missed a beat. We were talking about the weather. We're talking about her family. We're telling jokes. She was asking what those noises were. Is her brain going up a sucker? And yet then again, there are areas of the brainstem that if you touch with the head of a pin, you will get a profound, permanent neurological deficit that you can predict with 100% accuracy. So I wondered about this dichotomy. And when I read Aristotle and I read St. Thomas, they explained the dichotomy very, very nicely, that the vegetative and sensory aspects of the soul, powers of the soul, are linked to matter in a very tight way. Vision, locomotion, hearing, sensation, control of blood pressure, all those things are like computer wires. They're all very, very specific. However, in human beings, we have a rational soul, and the rational aspect of our soul allows us to think abstractly without specific perceptual basis. And abstract thought is an immaterial power of the soul. It's not linked tightly to the body. The body is necessary for exercise of abstract thought. If you get hit on the head with a baseball bat, your ability to do mathematics is going to be compromised for a while, but it's not sufficient. The mathematics doesn't come from the brain. So that was my impression early on in my career, that there were different kinds of thought, and one kind didn't come from the brain, although the brain may be permissive for it in some ways. And then I read the research of Wilder Penfield, who found exactly the same thing, and did fascinating stuff. And just one more fascinating observation that I think has not been recognized in medicine at all, as far as I know, since Penfield. Epilepsy can manifest itself with any number of neurological phenomena, with twitching of muscles, loss of consciousness, perceptions, things in your visual field. It can evoke memories, it can evoke emotions, all sorts of things. But it never evokes abstract thought. There are no calculus seizures. There are no seizures that make you do philosophy or make you think of Shakespeare and things like that. And Penfield noted this, and he said, why not? He said, if abstract thought comes from the brain, once in a blue moon, some random seizure is bound to just make you start doing long division, but it never, ever does. And that's a fascinating observation. It's been my observation, and no one ever talks about it. So if the brain gives rise to the mind without remainder, how is it that much of our thought, particularly our capacity for abstract thought, is never evoked accidentally by a seizure? Never. So you put all this together, and it seemed to me that St. Thomas provided a beautiful explanation for why this is true, that we have rational souls and that our intellect and our will are not material.
And again, very, very close parallels here with Vedanta Sankhya understanding, because the rational thinking functions would pass to the mind, which the mind is kind of almost artificial consciousness. It's what we are experiencing of the world as the mind is presenting itself to us. But consciousness has its own ability to be aware, to express itself, free will. It's a source of free will and volition. But for the most part, we tend to take how the mind is presenting the world. And if there's a stimulus come into the body, I smell something tasty, then the mind is stimulated to think, oh, must have a bag of chips or something. And, and we go, yeah, that's what I want. Mm-hmm. We become subservient to that kind of process where the senses are picking up stuff and the mind is interpreting it as a way of trying to help us experience and enjoy life. And for the most part, we kind of go along with it. So it's interesting because the Sankhya analyzes that basically the body is 10 senses, 5 knowledge acquiring senses and 5 working senses. And of course, there's lots of individual ones. The heart's got its own system, and and all the kind of metabolic processes that go on with it. But those are the 10 big ones that we tend to kind of use to interact with the world. Mm-hmm. And basically, that's the job of the nervous system, including the brain. Whereas the other kind of intellectual pursuits are kind of generated within the mind. And when Vedanta and Sankhya analyze the mind, they divide it into 3 functions, sub-functions. They have mind as the kind of repository and representation of what the brain and senses are gathering. Mm-hmm. That gets into the area of qualia, which I want to kind of talk about. Then it says there's buddhi, which is a kind of intellectual kind of, it's dealing with attention, focus, discrimination, in a discernment, and actioning certain items either for awareness or for activity. And then there's a thing called the ahankar, which is the kind of persona self that we have of ourselves in this world. And although we are pure consciousness, we kind of have adopted this persona self image, which if we were to talk about ourselves, we will talk about how we think our appearance is, our physicality as humans, as male, female, and how we interact with others, how we see the world, how we believe. All those things are wrapped up in the ahankara. It's kind of this persona image we have of ourselves, which in one sense is something we have adopted. Mm-hmm. It's not the soul itself. And part of the yoga process is to try and understand one's conscious spiritual nature separate from the persona self. And to understand that in the spiritual existence, in relationship with God, we will manifest a spiritual persona, which is ourselves. It's the real self. Whereas in the material world, an example is these days virtual reality, gaming and things. It's almost like this may be the real me, but I go into the game and I set up an avatar. Mm-hmm. That becomes me. And it's interacting with all the stuff around it. And I think that what I'm experiencing is that interaction. So that kind of gives a kind of broader model of consciousness's interaction with this world and sees it in a theological context. Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you about, because I'd heard you talk about these aspects of rationality not being present within the different regions of the brain. But at the same time, even the perception stuff isn't there in the brain, is it?
Right.
Because when you talk about the tree, it's never mind thinking about what a tree is existentially, even the greenness that I'm experiencing of the leaves, the wavelength of light coming into my eyes, that's just activating certain cones. It's sending bleep messages back to the visual processing area, but there's no picture. Right. How is it I'm experiencing a picture in all of that? A picture with qualities such as color, forms, movement, those type of qualia. So even the perception activities that the brain does is not sufficient to explain our experience.
Absolutely.
Never mind the rationality ones as well.
Absolutely. There is a neuroscientist named Bennett and a philosopher named Hacker from Oxford. Bennett's from Australia, who've written on that extensively, and I think they've done brilliant work. Their magnum opus is the Philosophy of Neuroscience, I think it's called, but they've written a number of other books. And it's really lovely work. And they pointed out that much of what ordinary folks and neuroscientists say about the relationship between the mind and the brain is simply incoherent. That is, that the idea that we see things in our brain or that visual images exist in the brain or the brain thinks and things like that just make no sense. So they argue very strongly for kind of cleaning up our language. They call it conceptual hygiene. That it's perfectly okay to say that proper functioning of the optic apparatus in the eyes and the brain is a necessary condition for vision. But the eyes don't see, and the brain doesn't see. The person sees, Hacker is a student of Wittgenstein, and is very deeply influenced by him, which I think is a good thing. I think Wittgenstein had a lot of deep insights, and he is a bit of an Aristotelian, although he's not a passionate Aristotelian. Penfield has had some fascinating insights into this separation, one might say, of mind and brain functions. He would stimulate the motor cortex in people when they were awake, which would cause them to move a limb. He would stimulate the arm area, and they'd raise their arm. And he tried an experiment repeatedly where he would ask people, I'm going to, once in a while, without telling you, stimulate the part of your brain that makes you move your arm. And I want also you to move your arm on occasion when you wish to do so. And I want you to tell me whether you moved it or I moved it. And of course, they can't feel the brain, so they don't know if he's doing it. And he said that he had 1,100 patients that he did this with over a period of a number of decades, and no one ever got it wrong. That is, that every time that the arm movement was caused by him stimulating, Penfield would say, well, what happened with your arm? And the patient would say, well, you made me move it. And when the patient would move it, the patient would say, no, I moved it. You didn't make me move it. And so what Penfield concluded from that was that there was an aspect of volition in human beings which he couldn't find in the brain. It wasn't there. That people always knew if they were forced to move by stimulating the cortex. So he said there was a part of the mind he couldn't reach, that it wasn't a material thing, and he couldn't reach it materialistically. So and that was a fascinating observation. The work of Roger Sperry, I think, is also very interesting. And Sperry was a Nobel laureate who did work on split brain research. And split brain procedure is a procedure where the corpus callosum, a connection between the hemispheres of the brain, is cut, so to help mitigate seizures. And I noticed years ago, it's not my particular specialty within neurosurgery, but I've done the surgery, and I've cared for a number of patients who've had it, and they're perfectly normal people after the surgery. You cut their brains functionally in half, and the only discernible difference, hopefully, is that their seizures are better. Sperry found some very subtle differences in perceptual ability. And there was a perceptual isolation of hemispheric hemispheric activity to some extent. That is, that if you present information to the right hemisphere, that the information could not be used in a way that required the left hemisphere. Only the right hemisphere could handle it in metaphorically. So, for example, if you presented information to the right hemisphere, if you showed the word apple in a visual field, only the left hand could pick an apple out of a container of fruit to show what was being seen, because the left hand is controlled by the right hemisphere. So the hemispheres were perceptually and in terms of motor function separated in patients with corpus callosotomy. So this created quite a stir, and as I said, he won the Nobel Prize for it. It's fascinating work, but patients almost never notice this in everyday life. This is not something that they're even aware of. In the 1980s, there was a woman named Justine Sargent at McGill University in Canada who carried Sperry's work further, and there's now a guy named Yars Pinto, who's doing work on this. And they looked into it more deeply. I always thought that the most remarkable thing about Sperry's research was not what he found, but what he didn't find. That is, that he found very subtle things that were so subtle it took Nobel Prize level research to find them. But on the other hand, the patient's brains were chopped in half, and they were basically no different. And that ought to mean something. It's the elephant in the room, and the elephant in the room was kind of ignored, that the patients didn't change much. So Sargent looked at things in a very interesting and subtle way. What she did was she would present letters to patients' visual fields. So she would put a K or an E in a visual field intermittently. The visual fields, if done properly, will route those images to one or the other hemisphere. And in corpus callosotomy, it can only go to one hemisphere if it's in one visual field. And what she would then do is, once she got the people used to seeing these letters and recognizing them, is she put buttons by their right and left hand. And she would say, when you see a vowel, push a button with your hand, either hand. And what she found was that when she put a vowel into the say the right hemisphere's visual field that can only control the left hand, that the patient would push the button that the patient had seen the vowel as often with the right hand as they did with the left hand. There was a 50-50. It didn't matter. But the right hand is controlled by the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere has never seen that vowel. So it was implying that there was a knowledge of what was being seen. And that knowledge was independent of the connections between the hemispheres of the brain. You didn't need the connections to know. Essentially, the person didn't need to know what individual hemispheres were seeing, and the hands could respond symmetrically to that. It's fascinating work. Yars Pinto has looked at the same kind of phenomena, and what they have come to call it is, conceptual unity with perceptual split. That is, that there's a split perception, but the concepts are not dependent upon the connection of the hemispheres at all.
Let's explore this one a little bit more, because I really value the experience you've had on this. Vedanta would model that in terms of, as I said, the mind kind of basically gathering the data of the brain and making sense of it for us, whether qualitative or quantitatively. Yes. And there's a couple of, so I hadn't heard that there was that type of interconnection after the corpus callosum was split. I'd read some material on that. Is it an argument by some that says, well, the brain is expert at rewiring, and it's plasticity of this neuroplasticity of that is going on there, and that somehow or other connections are being formed that helped?
Yeah, the both Sargent and Pinto have looked at that question, and they've looked at it a couple ways. First of all, when you cut the corpus callosum, there are pathways through which the hemispheres still could connect, but they're multisynaptic. That is, the corpus callosum is this huge fiber bundle that is sort of the direct highway. But using multiple levels of connection, the hemispheres could still connect through the basic ganglia, the brainstem. There are ways to get the information across. However, it's very difficult to visualize that, to be able to actually directly test it, but it can be tested in this fashion. In order for, we know the rate at which the action potentials propagate in the brain. And if they're taking a circuitous route for one hemisphere, but not for the other, there would be a slight difference in the response time of pushing the buttons. And Sargent particularly looked for this in detail. She looked for this timing difference, and there was zero timing difference.
That's a big one.
Just as quick. So there wasn't even the resolution that was down to a few milliseconds. So there wasn't a difference. So her belief, and Pinto, I believe, feels the same way, is that there just isn't any evidence for the use of other connections. The other thing is that if indeed the information was being passed through these other pathways, then why is there a perceptual split? Because there's no question that there is a perceptual split. It does happen. Why is it only for concepts that you can integrate the two, but not for precepts? So I think the idea of accessory pathways doesn't hold water. The other thing that Sperry observed is that people were occasionally unconsciously giving themselves clues as to what was happening to try to get a workaround. And the classic example was there was a patient in whom Sperry had determined that his speech area was unquestionably in his left hemisphere. So that when he would present an object to his left hemisphere, he could say what it was, but when he would present the object to his right hemisphere, he couldn't, because the right hemisphere wasn't capable of speech. But he could pick the object out of a bag, so he knew what it was. He just couldn't say it. But Sperry found that with numbers, the guy could say the number, even if it was presented to his non-language hemisphere. So if he presented the number 4 to his non-language hemisphere, the guy would say 4. And but if he presented an apple, the guy wouldn't know how to say apple. And he found something else peculiar. He found that the larger the number, the longer it took the guy to say it. So, for example, if he presented 4, the guy might delay a second before he said 4, whereas, or a few seconds. If he presented 8, he would delay twice as long before he said 8. So Sperry videotaped him. So the guy was sitting at a desk, and when he was doing the test, and what he found was that when say for example, the number 4, the visual information from number 4 came to the right hemisphere controls the left leg. The guy's left foot would tap his right foot 4 times. And then he would feel in his left hemisphere what was happening in his right foot and know it was 4. But the patient was unaware of it. He didn't know he was doing it. So it was an unconscious workaround. And that's why it took twice as long with numbers twice as big. So Sargent and Pinto looked for workarounds like that. And they didn't find them. They videotaped the patients, and they don't find workarounds.
Okay, so those weren't. It was in that particular case, but not in the normal ones that Sargent.
Right. They couldn't find conceptual workarounds. There was no evidence that the patients were signaling. So this phenomenon of signaling has become kind of a mainstay in split brain research. So when people do split brain research, they always look for signaling, because that can confuse the results. And there was no evidence of signaling. So it holds together fairly well. That abstract thought is not split, whereas perceptual abilities are split by splitting the brain.
Okay, thank you. I want to kind of explore a couple of more aspects on this type of thing. because you mentioned the delay that would be there if it wasn't using the corpus callosum's kind of highway and trying to use other network. What about time delay in perception? The time it takes for the brain to process audio signals from the ears compared to visual signals. We experience the clap. Probably not happening in Zoom. It's not a very good way of demonstrating that because there is a delay. But we experience sound and sight together. But a lot of researchers are saying there is a significant difference in the time it takes the brain to deal with the data.
Yes.
And
Well, there was Benjamin Libet. I'm sure you've heard of him. He's a physiologist in the mid 20th century, brilliant man, who was fascinated by what he called mind time. In fact, he wrote a popular book called Mind Time. And Libet's question was, when we have a mental experience, what is going on at that moment simultaneously in the brain? And it's a very difficult thing experimentally to look at. But he did it in a very systematic way. And he's most famous for his work on free will, which we can get into. But Libet believed that he confirmed that free will is real, although his work is frequently cited as a denial of free will. It wasn't at all a denial of free will. But I think Libet's most interesting work was on sensory perception. And what Libet did was he recorded from the cortex or from the scalp and the cortical electrical activity, and he would prick people's fingers with a pin, and he would ask them to push a button the instant they felt the finger prick. And what he found was that the fingerprint prick would happen. The person would say he felt it within 100 milliseconds or less of the actual contact with the finger. And the brain would not show any difference in cortical activity for about 500 milliseconds, for about half a second. There was an enormous delay. So the patient was feeling the finger prick, at least in Libet's paradigm, 400 milliseconds, almost half a second, before the brain was aware of the finger prick in the sense of having any electrical activity. And this floored Libet. He said, how is it conceivable that the brain has no activity whatsoever, but the patient clearly knows that he has pain in his finger? I think Libet made the wrong explanation. Libet's explanation was that the brain backdated it. What the brain did was the brain was accustomed, and again, I'm using loose metaphorical languages because brains don't become accustomed to anything. They're just lumps of flesh. But that the brain became accustomed to the fact that there's a half-second delay, and it makes you think that you experience the event a half-second earlier. So it's a mental trick. But I think that's a cumbersome and unnecessary inference. I think that the problem is we're too brain-centric. That is, we believe that in a sense, it's almost the Cartesian mistake. Descartes, I think, made terrible mistakes in terms of understanding the mind and the brain relationship. And Descartes saw basically the soul as a distinct substance from the body, the res cogitans and res extensa, and they somehow had to kind of interact at the pineal gland or something. And materialists have gotten rid of the soul part of it and kept the res extensa, except that they have introduced now the mind becomes the brain becomes a res cogitans. They've just substituted soul for brain. And I think that's all a mistake. I think what Aristotle would say is that a person is his entire body, and that we experience the finger prick at our finger because we are every bit as much our finger as we are our brain.
Yeah.
That is so.
I suppose Vedanta would look at it differently and say that actually, although the brain is receiving data and will be acting on that, it's actually the mind which is ultimately faster and more nimble at receiving
Yes.
the circumstance and presenting that to us.
Yes.
Because that delay system is being used in a very horrible way by many physicalists these days.
Yes.
They are saying, well, there's a half-second delay between processing sound and processing vision, but we hear the same. So is it that we're experiencing before the brain's processed? That cannot be. How
Right.
could that possibly be? Therefore, we must be experiencing the world on a half-second delay.
Right. Right.
That means
Right.
that even if we are experiencing, we are superfluous to the world. It's basically going on, and the brain's organizing everything, and we are just this ephemeral kind of illusion that we are experiencing things.
What amazes me about that, first of all, is what a bizarre tap dance, what a bizarre evasion of sort of the obvious truth, is
Exactly.
that we have a spiritual existence that is mediating this, and the brain is doing what the brain does, but the brain is not the central player in this. The other thing you would mention, which I find as fascinating as you do, is that in philosophy of mind, the emergence of panpsychism, the subtle physics, and all of those things, all one has to do is acknowledge the existence of God and of the human spirit and the human soul, and these problems vanish. Then everything makes sense, and they won't do it. They'll do anything except the obvious. It's just amazing. Materialism and physicalism, I think, I don't even think of it as a philosophy. It's just a mistake.
I've heard you speak on that, and I fully agree. And I found, I've been saying that also. That
Yeah.
I mean, science is too important for human society to be under the sway of any particular singular philosophy interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
And to put it under physicalism, which doesn't even qualify philosophically,
Right.
There is no a priori basis, no a posteriori basis for physicalism.
Right.
What on earth, why on earth should we interpret scientific evidence through that lens? It makes no sense whatsoever.
Absolutely. But then again, I suspect that it had something to do with an apple. I think that I think original sin is a real issue, and I think there is something desperately wrong with humanity, with the human soul in each of us, and we try to evade the truth. We want to set ourselves up as the people who govern reality, and physicalism, I think, is a rather clumsy attempt to do that.
And that's a very Vedantic point of view. When you mentioned the apple, the other apple that caused probably the same problem is the one attributed to falling on Newton. Because that's kind of set off Western, with an ideology that it thinks is intellectual, rational, and explains the world, but leaves out the actual most important aspect is our own awareness of this world and who and what we are.
Well, I believe very, very much in the existence of a spiritual world, and not simply in God and in the human spirit, but in other spirits. And I must say that I think there's a sense of humor out there. I've always thought it was deeply ironic that the first really successful computer manufacturer was named Apple. And we are in the computer revolution under the impression that we can create artificial intelligence. So there's so much bizarre, what I think, bad philosophy and bad science happening now in information technology and in the computer revolution. And it's so ironic that the first really widely available computer was called an Apple, because we're just doing it again. So.
I mean, mentioning artificial intelligence, I think we have to at least just give a few moments for that.
Sure.
I've been part of kind of a high-level think tank trying to bring together views of religion and the ethics of AI. And we were well briefed and by some of the biggest names in Britain on the AI scene, including the guy who's in charge of DeepMind, the Turing Institute, Leverhulme. They all came to discuss it with us. And it's pretty clear that most of the people who are actually in the know on AI do not really regard the possibility of that algorithms, systems, AI can actually become sentient in the way we would understand sentience.
Right.
They'll certainly become more intelligent than us.
Well, I think all the intelligence in a computer is us. That is that and in the same way that it may very well be that that the volume of Shakespeare's work is more intelligent than Shakespeare, in a sense that even when Shakespeare was alive, he may have forgotten some of his plays, he may have been confused about things, but the books don't forget and they don't get confused. But it doesn't mean the books are intelligent. They're just physical manifestations of Shakespeare's intelligence.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm not so concerned that people are going to worry that we are going to create computers, etc., that are sentient like ourselves. The bigger problem that is being presented from all of this is that it's equating human rationality, human knowledge processing, human intellect, and consciousness as simply a cognitive programming function. And
yes,
it's downplaying humans.
Right.
And that is the greater danger from it, I think.
And while I think that the application of computational concepts to neuroscience certainly has a very rich history, and it's a major theme in neuroscience, is perfectly appropriate if you are looking at modeling the brain in a computational fashion. That's perfectly reasonable. But that doesn't mean the brain is a computer. And I believe very strongly that the brain is that the mind is the antithesis of computation. So not only is it not computation, it's exactly what computation is not. And by that, I mean that the mind, what the hallmark of the mind, of course, I think, is intentionality. The ability for a thought or a perception to be directed at something, and the hallmark of computation is the lack of meaning in the process of computation itself. That is, a very good example would be you can type using Microsoft Word 2 different essays taking opposite viewpoints. You can type an essay believing in A, and then type an essay that believes that A is not true. And Microsoft Word doesn't care. It just puts down whatever you hit the key. It puts the letter on the screen. The reason that computation works so beautifully is because it's blind to meaning. It has no relation to meaning. It's just a mechanical process, whereas the mind is all about meaning. So the mind is not a form of computation. The brain can be modeled in a rough way as computation, brain activity, but that doesn't mean the mind is computation. My biggest fear with artificial intelligence is by far the most dangerous intelligence that humanity deals with is humanity's intelligence, and humanity's intelligence has done some really, really mischievous things over the years. Artificial intelligence allows us to leverage our own intelligence in ways that are enormously powerful and could do enormous good and can do enormous harm. We're doing enormous good right now by using this wonderful system of being able to speak across oceans and things like that. But enormous harm can be done. And not only does it leverage our ability to do harm, but we're ignorant of that. That is, we don't understand that all of this stuff that's coming out of artificial intelligence is our intelligence. It's all us. and we've met the enemy, and he's us. So
yeah. Anil Seth here in the UK. You probably heard of me. Probably one of our leading neuroscientists. He says, "I'm not worried about artificial intelligence. I'm worried about real stupidity."
yeah.
And unfortunately, we have the potential of basically inserting our own stupidity, our bias, into the AI systems, because
Yes.
ultimately they're working on proxies for what they think humans are.
Mm-hmm.
You get a very, very dim view from the data that they're absorbing from all our online activity. They're getting a very dim view of what humans are and what they want. And that's what they will provide for us.
Yes.
So in one sense, that's out of control now. As Neil Lawrence, who's in charge of DeepMind, explained, with learning systems, there's no way of ever knowing what criteria AI uses in order to come up with a solution. You can ask it and it will give you an answer, but it doesn't mean the answer bears any connection with how it actually processed all of that.
Sure.
And the difficulty is that we are doing this on such large scales for humanity that one program can affect many, many people. In the past, my stupidity might have affected a handful of people around me, but now we have the potential for really spreading stupidity.
Are you familiar with René Girard? René Girard is he's a French literary theorist and philosopher, passed away a few years ago. But Girard was very interested in anthropology and in the sense of what it is to be human and what makes us human. And I think he had some of the best ideas along those lines in modern times. And his theory of what makes us human is that we are mimetic, we imitate. And his theory of mimesis is that he was Catholic and he was very much a believer, and he believed that we were created to imitate God, and that was our job on earth. And we got it messed up, and we started imitating everything else except him, and particularly what we imitate is each other. And our imitation of each other extends to the imitation of desire. That is, that we not only imitate what other people do, we imitate what other people want. And of course, Madison Avenue knows that very well in advertising. You know, your favorite athlete on TV, if you see him drinking a certain kind of soda, you want to have the same soda he's drinking because you imitate his desire. And Girard pointed out that in any group of people who are like in a town or a city or any society, that this imitation of desire is an enormously destructive process, because we desire things that we can't all have, and we fight each other for it. So I may imitate the desire of my friend for a girl, or for a job, or for an object that I'd like to own that he owns. And what it leads to is what he called mimetic contagion, where this imitation becomes a fire, and it destroys societies, civilizations. So he asked the question is, how do people get out of this? Why don't we all kill each other? And he said the usual technique that has been used throughout history has been what he called scapegoating. And there's one kind of imitation of desire or imitation of behavior that can create peace. And that is if you blame everything on one person. So if a society is getting this fervor of imitation, they pick out one person or one group of people in that society and blame them for all these problems. And commonly, they will kill the person. And the obvious example that he cites is the Holocaust in Weimar, Germany. It was a terribly distressed society. They had terrible economic and social problems, and the Jews became the object. They became the scapegoat, and they felt better in a sense when they were persecuting Jews. It took some of the pressure off them. So anyway, what Girard believed was that the Jewish and Christian way of looking at the world, and he didn't address other faiths very much, and I don't know enough about Hindu faith to comment on that. But he said that the Jewish and Christian way of looking at the world was an effort by God to teach us that scapegoating is wrong, that we can't get out of this fervor of desire and of imitation and violence unless we imitate God. That the only way we can do it, and that imitating God, Christ was an innocent victim. He was a scapegoat, but he was completely innocent, and that was really what Christ's sacrifice was to show us that you need nonviolence, you need to get away from violence. And my concern is that this mimetic desire that is so destructive to our society is potentiated incredibly by the internet. That we can imitate now. I can imitate the desires of someone in China and anywhere in the world instantaneously, whereas it used to be I could only imitate a desire of a person next door to me. So I think the internet is a Girardian apocalypse, and I think we're heading for a real apocalypse, actually.
I see the danger you're talking about there. Yeah, you mentioned something that we are here in this world and we're mimicking God. And the Vedantic idea is that, actually the Vedantic idea is that we are mimicking God in that we want to be the center, the creator, the controller of everything. Yes. And so in that sense, we have mimicked in an unhealthy way. And when you've got lots of people mimicking God in this world, 8 billion of us, plus we haven't talked about consciousness in other creatures or elsewhere in the universe, but at least in human terms, we've got 8 billion of us all kind of competing for resources, all desiring far more than we can deserve or can ever attain. That's a serious problem. So that's why the Gita said scapegoating is a safety valve for society, perhaps to keep peace, but certainly not a healthy one at that. And the Gita suggests actually you're only going to do this when you actually understand God as the ultimate controller of everything, not you, God. And God is the ultimate owner of everything because everything belongs to God. It's his energy. And ultimately, he is the friend of all. Mm-hmm. He is the well-wisher. And he's a well-wisher of each one of us. And that's why the Bhakti system of Vaishnav philosophy is that how do we deal with our own nature in this world? Because we recognize that I do want to be the center of things. I do want to have things for my enjoyment. I do want to have better and bigger and more things. And I'm willing to kind of think ill of others who've got more. So I'm pretty contaminated in my attitude to others. How do I address this? And rather than, we wouldn't put it that you would want to mimic God in that way, but what we say is, there are processes in Hinduism to cover everything. There are processes which would cover your behavior, codes of behavior, which are dharma. Dharma is not morality given by God. Dharma is, if you want to be authentic to a good person, here's the sort of output that you would have. So it's a nice way of making it very personal and self-disciplining. So then there's, I could control the mind, perhaps, through meditation, through, those sort of yoga processes. I could control my intelligence about what I think is the right and wrong things to do. For Vaishnavas, all of those are okay. But what we try to do is to change the persona that is at the heart of the problem. rather than think I am this material object that needs material fulfillment and therefore sees myself at odds with other material beings. If I understand myself, my actual identity, as being the eternal servant of God, that's the identity I want to adopt for myself. Now I'm thinking, how does that play out? What does that mean to be the eternal servant of God, to be the loving servant of God?
Mm-hmm.
How do I express that then in all my activities? So that becomes the central part of our meditation, of our prayers, of our worship, of our activities, of our outreach, service, whatever. And it's that transformation of that persona aspect, which is a very exciting kind of path, and which at least then gets us to the point of, as the Gita says, as we take a step towards God, God takes many steps towards us.
Yes.
And as we give our heart, and it's true of anyone, as we give our heart to anyone, we kind of discover them back, and they reveal themselves, and the relationship deepens. So that's the kind of process that we see at the heart of Bhakti Yoga.
The parallels between the sort of the Thomistic way of looking at life and the Vedanta ways are I think are quite striking. David Bentley Hart wrote a lovely book called The Experience of God, in which he pointed out, it was actually much to my surprise, because when I read the book, I really hadn't understood this, how similar the great faiths are in terms of many of the fundamental ways of understanding God and of understanding life. It's quite fascinating. And I think the reason for it is that we're all looking at the same thing. And this is our way of seeing it. On your notion of the critical issue is each person and their relation to God, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who's sort of a hero of mine, he was a wonderful man. I think his most profound insight when he said was that the line between good and evil runs through every human heart. That is, if you want to go fight a battle with evil, fight a battle between good and evil, just look in your own heart. You don't have to go out in the world and fight dragons. It's all inside here, and that's what you have to get right. And I think the way you get it right is to love and know God, and we're all trying to find Him. So.
Yeah. Thank you. I think I've really enjoyed all the points that you've made, and I think we're probably very close in spirit and how we look at and see the world.
Sure.
We may phrase things differently. We may model who we are and how that we think we interact with the world. And I always look at it that these are models. We can never be sure what the reality. When you model something, you're giving yourself a workaround, as you said, for how to understand things, how they happen. But we've got to be careful, never kind of going into battles just because my model appears different to someone else's model.
Absolutely. And what I've learned in my own life, I keep telling my kids and the students at the medical school about this, is that I've been wrong so many times about so much stuff that I'm at a point now where I definitely have strong opinions, but I can be wrong about a lot of stuff. But one thing I don't think I'm wrong about is about God's existence and about God's love and about His sovereignty. That's the one thing I'm sure of. So.
I'd like to add that I don't think the similarities between different faiths are because we're empirically collecting the data, that there's a descending element that God is making knowledge about the spiritual reality and about Himself available to different degrees in different traditions.
Yes, it's kind of interesting that I try to go to daily mass, and I was at mass today, and our priest commented that he got into a lot of trouble a number of years ago when he made a comment in a homily that many Muslims, even perhaps Muslim terrorists, might end up in heaven. And he said the reason he said that was that even people who commit terrible acts, if they commit it because they honestly believe it is the right thing to do, if they're following, if they really believe that is what God wants, that may be enough for God. That is that we can all be wrong about things, and we all are wrong about things. None of us has a complete insight here, but it's the heart that God judges. So he said that we shouldn't exclude, we shouldn't assume that people who don't see things theologically exactly the same way we do, even in some rather extreme circumstances, are not under God's care and are not loved by God. That hopefully we'll all meet in heaven. It'd be awfully nice.
But I think, again, that's a very nice Vedantic thought, because Vedanta does not see itself as a particular faith that applies only to one group. It's often interpreted like that. And I've been asked, oh, you're following a Hindu thing? I speak on the BBC for Hindu theology. And they say, yeah, but you're not of that background. But really, as Vaishnav Hindus, we are those Hindus who don't think Hinduism is for Hindus. We think this is knowledge. This is relationship with God, which is absolutely the common legacy for all souls, wherever you are, whatever you're doing. And that it is this idea of a path of devotion to God is a central theme. And however one understands how I will develop my love for God, that's the same path. It's not a different path. We may give it different names, we may give it different codes and backgrounds and all sorts of things, but it's the same path.
Mm-hmm. One of the, and actually this is a wonderful opportunity. I've wanted to ask this question of someone who knew a great deal about Hindu philosophy and theology. From the Christian perspective, India has long been thought of as a tremendous mission field. It's a very large population. We would love nothing more than to convert India. That'd be big, but it's always failed on a large scale. Obviously, there are many Christian Hindus, and why do you feel that is? I mean, meaning that in speaking with you, is it that people from a Hindu background don't see anything sufficiently new in Christianity to make it appealing? Is there something about the Christian perspective that's not agreeable to people who come from the Hindu perspective? Why has Christianity not succeeded in India like it has in many other places around the world?
It's probably a very, very interesting question that deserves its own kind of dissertation.
Right.
But let me just offer a few thoughts at the moment. I think the perspective that is embedded in Hindu culture is that when spirituality, it's individualized, it's expressed by where I'm at. There's an old joke which I often tell from Ireland. You stop someone on the road and you say, "Oh, which is the way to Kilkenny?" And they say, "No, I wouldn't start from here." Now, we've each got to start the path to God from where we're at. Mm-hmm. And therefore, there has to be multiple first steps for people. What's the next step in their realization? And that's why there is such plurality in the Indian tradition. The Vedas offer different ideas, different ways in, different ways of encouraging people, different ways of orientating them towards a kinder, more generous spirit. Some of them, and if you want to take it very seriously, mystically, there's steps for that. So every base is already covered.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And therefore, people know that they can be on that path, they can find their path, and There is, and also because I think that there are distinctive issues that probably are inbred culturally, some theological issues on the nature of the soul, which is distinct from an Abrahamic viewpoint. And that is that all life is there because consciousness is present in that being. And the consciousness is the Atma. And the Atma is essentially the same which, in whatever state it's incarnated. So there is no real difference between me as a conscious entity experiencing life in a human being and that conscious being in an ant. Mm-hmm. What we're limited by is the machinery of our senses and the mechanism of our brain and the mind going with that. So obviously our rationality would be so much less developed or less expressed in that circumstances. But in that ant, there is a conscious little soul thinking, I'm just looking around for food, looking around to do my bit today and enjoy myself. Sure. So that gives a very interesting perspective. And the other is the eternal aspect of the Atma. That I've been here before, I've done this incarnation, I've done, we're going round and round in these things. So I think that the sudden, special creation of the soul doesn't sit so well in that sort of context. And for many, I'm not sure that this salvation is the only way. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That message doesn't also sit.
Right.
And so I think there are a number of factors like that. These days, conversion in India is a touchy point.
Yeah, I can imagine.
The ethical behavior of many of the missions is definitely got to be questioned.
Oh, really? What are they doing? What's the?
There's a lot of it is focusing on people who are disadvantaged or, I'm not going to, Hindu society or Indian society as it is now cannot really be a reflection on the religious kind of interests, but it has, there's definitely outcasts and those who are kind of on the outside of society, and they might find community and belonging in, from the Christian missions. Mm-hmm. And often they will be coming to the missions for other motivations other than pure spirituality.
Sure. But why is that bad? Meaning that
No, it's that alone isn't bad, but there has been certain cases where it does seem to be. Conversion always in the society is always can be regarded as overstepping the mark very easily.
Sure.
I've experienced that even in my own life.
Right.
So I got some pretty heavy reaction from some family and friends in Ireland. But anyway, so it's always good to give people options, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And I have no problem with anyone of faith making available what inspires them. And if they can do that in a way that offers the same open principles that they can take within their own practice, within their own faith, and not feel that they have to leave something behind. Like, for instance, I don't think I ever left behind the spirituality of my youth.
Right.
And it was interesting. My father, who was a lifelong churchgoer, very deeply committed to his church, and very strict in his kind of ethical principles and practices. Teetotal all his life, never gambled. A good Northern Ireland Protestant, and a very generous, warm-hearted person. But he saw my adoption of the Vaishnava faith. Almost he was envious of it, in that I had done something specifically for God, and gone and joined an ashram and dedicated myself in that way, which I think he would have loved to have done.
Sure.
Even though he, was absolutely diligent in raising his family, going to church, helping his community, working in the church, doing everything. I think he appreciated the path that I had taken. And I kind of liked that. I think that is a type of religious mentality that finds, I think that's the sort of thing that opens people's hearts.
Absolutely. I mean, it certainly takes considerable courage. I mean, in the cultural environment, it sounds as though in which you were raised, to embrace Vedantic theology is a very courageous act. Regarding the different understandings of the soul between Vedanta and Christianity, from the Thomistic paradigm, of course, ants have souls as well, as do plants. Every living thing has a soul. They don't have rational souls, but they have sensitive souls or vegetative souls. So we I guess are different in that respect, to some extent, from the Vedantic view, and that we don't believe that ants have very, very little rational capacity. We believe they have none. But in that it's a fundamentally different kind of soul, but it is a soul. Regarding conversion and mission work and so on, which I'm not involved in particularly, just accept my disagreements with materialists. I mean, my goal in life, if you could say that I have a religious mission, is to bring people away from materialism and physicalism, because it was my religion for a long time, and it's a terrible, terrible mistake. There's a song by Leonard Cohen named Suzanne. I don't know if you know the song. And there's a line in it that I find so beautiful, and it has theological insight in which he says about Jesus that he waited until only drowning men could see him. And what that means to me is that Christianity, I think, has a particular appeal to people who are lost. It's although obviously there are plenty of people who are born into it and happy and no problems at all, a lot of people don't embrace it until they're at rock bottom. When I thought my son was autistic, there's tons of people who have been drug addicts and alcoholics and people whose lives were a total mess. And I think that is why perhaps people involved in mission work would seek out, the poor and the suffering, because that's what Christ said is that what you've done to them, you've done to me, meaning that I think Christ lives more so in people who are desperate. And for my own life, I think that although I've got a pretty good life in a lot of ways, inside I've been pretty desperate, meaning trying to figure out what this is all about, and just because one has professional and material success doesn't mean that your psyche is necessarily a happy place. And I could not be anything but a Christian because I could not leave Christ, meaning that it's a personal love, and it's a passionate love. And so I have enormous respect for Hindu philosophy, as I do and theology, as I do for the theology of many faiths. But I could not do it because I could not leave Christ.
Yeah.
And if I end up in heaven and I'm up there and the word is the Hindus got it right and the Christians got it wrong, I would tell them I'm still waiting on Christ. I'm waiting for him. So,
Yeah, fortunately, I just don't see it as one being right and everyone else wrong, because, as the Gita says, Krishna says, everyone follows my path in all respects.
mhm.
We're all on that path. And what inspires us, what gives us love, what gives us goodness, what gives us devotion, we stick with it. You said something which perhaps it's a great way of summing up, that you see your mission as challenging materialism, physicalism, because they're destroying people's lives.
Absolutely.
They're destroying human society in so many ways, and we think we got it right. Look at the mess we've got in this world, from environmental issues to poverty to inequality, what to speak of, wars, whatever. It's all because we've lost sight of how to live properly, what we're here for. So I would love to join forces with you
Good.
on
Good.
your crusade against materialism and physicalism. I've probably got a number of little questions which I'd love to discuss with you at another time.
I would
But
love to do it.
Very impressed and very much enjoyed this conversation this evening.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
That was a great discussion. Thank you both.
Privilege.
I just want to give my quick 2 cents on why I think Hindus are not so interested in Christianity. And we can use a Christian analogy to water in the desert. So like Jesus used this analogy, you take water to people in a desert who don't have any water and they're going to be very interested. But if you find people in this desert who already have water, they're not going to be so interested. So like you described with how your experience of Christ means you're not so interested in Hinduism. You're satisfied. Or another analogy is having a meal. If people are hungry, you bring them food, they're going to lap it up. But if they've already got better quality food, they're going to want to stick with the food. Or if it's food cooked by their mother, there's a relationship there. I want this food because this comes from my mother. So in spiritual shelter, you'll have this kind of relationship that these people gave me mercy. I first got mercy from these people in this connection. So then people are naturally going to have a kind of tribe there. Not like in a tribal sense of my tribe versus your tribe, but just these are my people. This is my family.
Yeah, my sense is that, and I actually suspect the same thing. That is that so much of the beauty of Christianity is already in Hinduism, meaning that there's a great deal of profundity and beauty. That basically people aren't desperate enough. that a lot of human needs are met by Hindu theology, that is a theory that I've heard people in mission work say that it's tough to break into it because there is so much depth and beauty in it that people just don't see enough of a difference to be worth changing. So
that reminds me of the other point I wanted to make, that just that the people being needy and suffering isn't necessarily based on a material sense, because people could be materially destitute but have immense spiritual depth.
Precisely. The people who are poor in spirit, I think Matthew got it right. When it's not blessed are the poor, it's blessed are the poor in spirit. The people who are suffering in spirit who come to Christianity. Because certainly materially poor, there are a lot of people in India are materially poor, but I don't think they're spiritually poor. The spiritual poverty you find, I think, in the West, in the science departments, and I think materialism is the spiritual poverty of the world today.
So that was a great discussion. I was hoping there'd be a bit more disagreement. Akhandadhi warned me the problem I'll have is there'll be too much agreement. I think if we had other proponents of Thomism on, there would be a lot more contention over, where Thomism disagrees with Vedanta views.
Yeah, I think, except the funny thing is, I don't think St. Thomas would disagree so much, meaning that the Thomism has a kind of a clique problem that, and I love Thomism, I love Thomas, but there are a lot of Thomists who are very narrow in the way they look at things. And while I think they're right about almost everything in terms of metaphysics, I think St. Thomas himself was a very broad-minded man. And let's face it, he embraced Aristotle when it was certainly not a good thing for a Catholic theologian to be doing. So he was willing to go outside of the Catholic world to learn the truth. And I think he would be very interested in Hindu philosophy as well.
Do you have any final comments, Akhandadhi?
No, so much enjoyed this conversation. Yeah, we have identified a number of distinctive points between our views, but that doesn't take away from some of the key elements that we should be working on in order to very clearly articulate the understanding that we are not just physical material entities.
Right.
And that there is no way that you can postulate that the physical reality is the all in all and it can even explain its own existence or can explain the nature of our conscious being. So we need a much bigger box to put everything in it. And
Yes.
when we can articulate the need for that box actually initially without having to invoke God.
Mm-hmm.
But if one wants to understand how everything ultimately holds together, that is not going to be possible without postulating and accepting the identity of an entity who is both the totality of all existence, but also the source of that existence and has an intimate relationship with all the parts of that reality, including each one of us. And that holds the whole thing together. And then that's when we can start taking advantage of that realization and cultivating the ecstatic, loving connection that we can have with them.
And it's wonderful because I think you're experiencing what I'm experiencing also to some extent, and what, of course, people of faith experience around the world, is once you realize that the ultimate reality is love. That's an awfully nice discovery. It's a discovery that I'm making. I'm nowhere near where I'd like to be, but that's an astonishing and very, very beautiful thing. So.
All right, I think that's a great note to close on. So thank you both for coming on. That was a great discussion.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been a real privilege. Thank you. Very, very nice to meet you.
Thank you, Michael. I hope we can keep in touch.
I look forward to it. Thank you. Yes.